Welcome to Foundstone Conversations, a series where we chat with industry leaders about what they're seeing across business strategy, connecting with customers, and sharing real-world experiences from across their own career. And today we're joined by Jordan Colreavy, who's the head of category strategy at one of the world's largest consumer goods companies, L'Oreal. So a very warm welcome to you, Jordan.
Thank you, Andrew. Good to be here.
Thanks for joining us. I know in some of our previous conversations, we've had some interesting conversations on all things strategy and broader. So looking forward to digging under the surface into a bit more detail today. Before we do that, I wanted to take a step back, and as I understand from conversations and reading your profile, it's always interesting, the guests we get on, to look at really some of their past and how they've arrived where they are now. So I believe you were fortunate enough to grow up in a family who ran many small businesses, from retail to furniture. And if I've got it right, you've learned a lot of the principles you even live by today through that. So can you tell us a bit more about that if we go far, wind back to those years?
You're taking me a long way back, Andrew, and I actually really like the question. It's not one that you typically go straight into, but it sort of maybe can tell you a little bit about who I am and I suppose how it shaped me. But my old man had many different businesses growing up. So it was quite interesting. He was in the rag trade for about 20 years, and I used to go along with him as quite a young kid in the holidays and watch him buy and sell at different wholesalers. He'd be selling then suits in a retail environment. So for me, it was just always quite interesting. How do products get to the store? How do they get to the shelf? So being able to go to a warehouse and watch him negotiate and purchase all these suits and ties and shirts, and then see him in the store with the staff and how they market the products. It was always it was an interesting experience for me. As quite a young person growing up, and then he sort of shifted into furniture, which was really interesting, because I thought, well, what do you know about furniture? You've been selling suits for 20 years and you're doing that really, really well. But as we kind of discussed a few years later, when I talked to my old man about why he made that shift, it was really interesting. He was looking at the market and he was seeing a bit of a change, particularly in retail clothes, and that localized, small business in that environment. There was lots of pressure on costs and price and competition. And he was essentially looking at an exit and moving into a whole new category, which, when you've got 4 kids and, we're at school trying to feed us all, it was a bit of a bold move to make. So to shift categories from clothing to furniture, we were quite amazed at how that transition actually happened. But the other part to, I think, what made it so interesting was he headed towards where his passion was, and he was actually really passionate about antique furniture and had all those basic principles learnt from buying, selling, running a store, staff, things like that, and essentially applied it to a whole new category, and built another business for another 20 years.
That's huge. I mean, as you say, that you paint that picture of the circumstance. You've got raising a family and the pressures that come with that, and to be able to take that leap is huge. And do you think that the learnings for him and then you now, it still comes back to some very fundamental principles that still are really relevant today?
Yeah, I think so. I think that the things I take away from that environment are, firstly, knowing who your customer is. And so location was so important for him back when he had his store. Yes, it was suburban stores, but just knowing who your customer was, particularly when he was starting the new venture, getting into antique furniture, he was able to tap into, I think, quite an interesting opportunity, which was he was able to buy a lot of his furniture and buy it quite well, which is where the margin was created. So he was able to buy products, if you like, secondhand furniture from essentially houses within the area that he was working in. So it wouldn't be uncommon for us to be driving to school and for us to stop by a house and put a flyer in one of the the houses that he saw. We're talking older style Australian houses that he could identify as ones that had the type of furniture he was looking for. So a lot of his customers actually that bought would also sell to him. So one of the things I learnt was, he typically made his money through buying, not selling. So one of the secrets, I think, to his success was finding the right products. But then it was the customers bringing those products to him in the end. And so, he developed quite a good business that was well known throughout Sydney.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's well, thank you for sharing that with us. It's brilliant to get that context. So if we fast forward to now, so your role as head of category strategy at a global recognized brand, of course, L'Oreal. If you can tell us a bit, just obviously everyone knows the brand, but about the organization, perhaps here in Australia, a bit of context, and then about your role. What's the kind of day in the life of your role in the bigger brand?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been at L'Oreal for almost 2 years now in Australia. Previous to that was working in food companies. So beauty was a whole new space for me. Part of the reason for the opportunity and the challenge, a bit like shifting, rag trade to furniture for me, out of my comfort zone, working in the beauty industry. We work with customers in grocery, which I was used to, but we also work with obviously pharmacies. We've got a large e-commerce set up as well with lots of customers in this market here, like Amazon, eBay, Door Beauty. So there's a wide range of customers that L'Oreal works with. And I think the other appeal for me when I look at what L'Oreal offers in this market is the array of brands and the categories that we play in. So the brands cater to a very wide ranging audience. And on top of that, we've also got different categories. So we're in hair care, hair color, cosmetics, skincare is where I focus. So I look after the skincare specific strategy as well as the men's portfolio. So broad ranging portfolios, broad ranging customer bases. The largest beauty company in the world, there was a lot to be excited about. And in terms of a day in the life, it's probably the thing I would sum up most is the pace. I've worked at lots of fast moving, FMCG, right? It's fast moving. It's not slow moving, but beauty seems to be another level of pace. And I love that about working at L'Oreal. Every day is almost different to the day before, and the array of different areas that my team and myself works on, from pricing strategies to promotions to category strategies. We work with range reviews with many of our retailers. So I think the variety for me was very attractive.
Oh, so yeah, that makes perfect sense. And in terms of the brand, obviously, hugely recognized brand. I know in one of our previous conversations, you shared a bit in terms of, the French culture and the influence on the brand, and then even the way from a forming strategy perspective, how that has influenced and continues to influence. And I found that really interesting. The more that intuitive approach. So can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's like no other culture company that I've worked for. I've worked for many companies that have, US backgrounds. Being a company that's based in France, I think that culture is very strong, and you feel it even in a country like Australia where we work. Just being at the company every day, you'll notice the diversity of cultures that we have. So it's a really strong theme that is current, and I think it's purposeful as well. So you find that there's different skill sets, different experiences, different cultures, as I said before, in the business. And that culture kind of leads to lots of creativity. So a big part of L'Oreal's success has been how innovative the company is and how it works creatively. And I think that comes from the diversity of thought and the diversity of experience and culture that exists in the business. So whilst for some it can be a challenge to work in an environment like that, where there's so many tensions and different thoughts and ideas, they somehow manage to harness it in a really interesting way. Intuition, you touched on before, is a strong part of the L'Oreal culture. And it's interesting as data and analytics start to come into the business, it's a really nice recipe for watching it unfold, if you like. You're seeing data and intuition, experience come together in this melting pot, but still driving a really strong creativity in the business, which it prides itself on.
Yeah, I think you painted a really nice picture there, because it's when in the context of strategy, it's sometimes when we blend in intuition, creativity, as you've called it, and in the broader concept of open strategy, the concept of serendipity is coming into it. And historically, we might look at strategy and we think, well, what's that got to do with a very process-driven strategy? And I'm sure there's obviously solid systems and process in the business. But I like how you talk about that in terms of intuition, creativity, and data obviously is a key part of it, as being a key bit, because we see that a lot of where strategy is moving. Those organizations that perhaps just focus on just the process-driven, perhaps miss those anomalies and insights, the top left and the top right. And it seems like you're doing that pretty well.
Yeah, look, I think you've described it exactly the way it feels to me. I'm from typically a process-driven business model. I've worked in lots of businesses where it's very step 1, step 2, step 3. L'Oreal's not like that. The rule book doesn't really exist for them. So it's just understanding the balance, I think, between having those processes when you need them, but then also not, I suppose, throwing a wet blanket over creativity and ideation and flexibility as well. I think they're the ingredients that make it so unique. So yeah, sort of my role is a bit of a conflicting role in that I'm in a part of the business where I do need to be driving process. I do need to be driving discipline around, good guidance and governance on promotions is a good example, where you do need to have those disciplines and rigor, but it's in the collaboration process of how do you get to those strategies? How do you bring different departments along the journey, like a marketing department, as well as a finance, when you're developing some of those strategies? That's where the magic essentially happens for us.
Yeah, for sure. I love how you put that, in a very positive context, the rule book doesn't exist, because I think a lot of the time from a strategy perspective, if you try to play within the traditional rule set and conventional rule set, we're all going to miss those opportunities. And because markets, you talked about the beauty industry being really fast paced, if you're perhaps playing within the constraints of a rule book, you're going to miss. So it's a really good example. Just on that note, I know we've talked briefly about it just before. What we see from a Foundstone advisory perspective is those insights that come from potentially very different industries or sectors, or very different product sets within a particular sector. And I know you shared just the start of a story in a previous conversation about another global brand who you've come across, and you're in conversations now around perhaps they're in a very different product set, through conversations and exploring perhaps some areas that other people might say, well, what has that got to do with anything with the L'Oreal brand? That you're starting to uncover some things that could be really interesting about sharing insights. Can you tell us a bit more about that and that brand and how that's unfolding?
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a great conversation that, we've had a couple of times now with yourself. And I think that the brand that we're working with at the moment from an ideation perspective is Red Bull. So, not initially, you to your point, you wouldn't think L'Oreal, Red Bull. How does that sort of make sense? Thinking about the categories that we're in, customers that we're playing in, and even the consumer base. But what I love so much about working in a business like L'Oreal is we've actually been able to bring together two of these businesses together and actually have an ideation session around what opportunities could exist. And what we've found is, in fact, there's huge commonalities between some of the consumer profiles. There's areas we're really strong in as a business in terms of the customers that we work with and some of the opportunities that they want to get into from a customer perspective, and how do we leverage some of these, I suppose, strengths that each of us has. and how do we bring those together and find those opportunities, whether it's a consumer activation, talking about what some of the, the brand goals that we've got, the brand goals that Red Bull have, tapping into some of the audiences that they talk to directly through some of their media, and likewise with us. So it's pretty early stages, but it's a really interesting conversation around how do we tap into, I suppose, the commonalities through the consumer, starting there, but then understanding what the strengths of each of the different businesses are and brands around communicating to, I suppose, these audiences, and what platforms can we tap into. So it's an amazing and it's an exciting opportunity, and I think it's gonna probably break some new grounds for us in terms of thinking differently and how to grow in an environment where growth can be hard to come by. And I think these are the ways that you can unlock new growth and differentiate yourself in the marketplace.
For sure, because I guess when I first came across you, you were on a panel conversation in another forum, and with your peer in Red Bull, and again, you've just shared it with us now. A lot of people probably would miss that next conversation about exploring opportunities, but the way you put it, the common ground in consumer profiles, and just you look at the L'Oreal and the Red Bull brands, they're two really unique, significant brands. And the fact that you're in conversation now, pushing the boundaries from a mindset point of view, for the good of the consumer, I think it's a brilliant example of very different product sets. But who knows where it goes and the outcomes. But I'm sure at a minimum, you're testing each other's mindsets to think outside the box. If that'd be fair to say.
It's a really, it's a really good summation of exactly what we're trying to do. And I think at the moment when you're in an environment that we're in, where we do need to think differently, we do need to go external. And I think this is something that we've spoken about before as well, but you can get caught up a lot of times in the four walls that you live in, whether it's working from home four walls or the four walls at work. How do you get external and get a different perspective of business, of the consumer, and just sitting in that environment and having that conversation actually makes you also appreciate what you've got. And they start to look at, in envy, some of the relationships you might have with customers or some of the different profiles that we really appeal to. And likewise, we feel quite the same in terms of how different their business is and how strong it is in different areas. So I think that external perspective for us, we probably need to do it a little bit more often. But it was a good reminder of getting outside of our everyday environment, off our computers, into stores, into different categories, and really seeing what's out there. So it definitely reinvigorated that excitement for us, I suppose, and that passion to do that.
For sure, it sounds like it. And though, again, the four walls, like you say, from the way people have been working the last couple of years, it kind of helps then stretch the minds in all those different areas, doesn't it? So I think so thank you for sharing that. I think it's a really very practical and a real example that we're seeing, is critical, that very different products or services to have those conversations and see, and a lot of the time things will come from it. So thank you for that.
Thanks.
In terms of strategy, so there's strategy is a big general word, isn't it? And there's a lot of different examples or different definitions of it. But when we apply strategy to your role within L'Oreal, I know I've heard a bit about you, talking about keeping really close to your partners, retailers, and the end customers. Some people define strategy by it's the choices you make. There's plenty of others. In very practical terms, how do you look at strategy in the context of your role and the organisation?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think for us, it's definitely a practical sense. We're big believers of, strategy shouldn't just be a document or a piece of paper or a workshop. It's got to be practical. It's got to be actionable. How do you execute it? So that's the lens that I typically put through when I'm working through different strategies and goals with the business. It's around essentially planning. For me, strategy is not a scary thing. I look at strategy as synonymous with planning. It's a roadmap, it's a vision, it's how we're going to get there, and it's giving people in the business a broader perspective in terms of, where do we want to play? How do we want to play? How are we going to win? What are the strategic priorities for us? What do we need to do first, second, third? At times it can feel like everything is a priority and we need to do everything. But in fact, we do have priorities, and we've got reasons for things to be priorities. So it's, I suppose, giving the business, as I said before, a roadmap, a vision. It's understanding that pathway and where does growth lie? How do we go about obtaining that growth? And we put that through a lens of a category growth, not a L'Oreal growth. So it's really important to differentiate that. And that's a big part of my role, is to help the business understand the category drivers. What are the consumer insights that we can leverage from our consumer team? What are the shopper insights in terms of what the shopper's doing in our retail environment with our customers? What are the customer strategies? What are their needs? So we typically look at it through a three-way win lens.
I see.
And that being L'Oreal, the customer who we sell our products to, the middleman, and the end user, the consumer/shopper. So they're the kind of three levers that we look at addressing in terms of, have we got a three-way win? If we generally can tick those three boxes, then it's typically good for the consumer. Is it good for the customer, and is it good for us? So that's a simple way of thinking about it.
I like it. In terms of those, you talked about, going external and into stores, and I know it's always, making the time for that is important.
Yeah.
So does that, in terms of, insights, I'm sure you have assistance for that as well from external people.
Yeah.
But is that something you try to work into your role and your team's role of getting in there right on the ground, on the street?
Yeah, absolutely. And I've got to say, I'm not good at it still, but it's something we definitely aspire to do. So whenever we've got shelf changes in stores, which happen every twice a year in different categories, we will allocate, or we'll make it mandatory at times to go out and do that with our field team. So changing the planograms in the store, spending a day there with our field team, so important. In terms of just seeing what's happening out there. How do the shelves fit together? How do the products look and feel? How do the ticketing work? You can talk to consumers while you're in the stores. You can talk to many of the pharmacists and the customers in the stores who own those businesses. And I think they're the richest conversations that you can sometimes have. Get away from the spreadsheet, get away from the boardroom, the strategy planning, and actually look at what's happening out there. How do the products fit on shelf? What do our competitors look and feel? Testing the products is another huge one for us.
Right.
How do you actually try the products, and have you used them? What's your feedback on those products? We have these type of discussions with the team. So, in an ideal world, Andrew, I'd be doing it once a month, but I'm not. But I would love to get out there once a month and make it a team thing. So we'll try to do like an early morning catch up with the team. We'll go into stores, we'll take photos, we'll share those photos around. How's our availability in the stores? How's our presence? How's our compliance? Beyond, as I said before, spreadsheet, but actually looking at the cold face of where the action is, where it happens.
Yeah, well, it's wonderful you're aware of that, because, as you say, it's very easy for, the big corporates, and it's easy for me to say that, it's a huge global business. So the process side is obviously hugely important. But the fact that you're aware that you're deliberately trying to carve out time for that, I think is really key, isn't it? Because, you talked about the look and feel. It's very hard to put that into a explicit number or a spreadsheet, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that's where it comes back to your point around intuition, creativity, and, what we're seeing even around serendipity. You might bump into a customer in a shop and have a conversation that makes you aware of something that is completely left field. So I think, that getting out of the spreadsheet is tough, isn't it? Because the systems and the process side is still hugely important, and you've got to try to carve time out, which it sounds like you're trying to do.
Yeah, and like I said, it's not where I want it to be. I started in the field
Understand.
back in the day, so
Yes.
I remember what it was like in the field, and I remember talking to people that were in head office, and how do you get people in head office to listen?
Yes.
Because
Yes.
typically, if you run an idea through somebody that's living out there and breathing that environment every day, they're a
Mm.
pretty good test for if something going to work. So it's something that I've definitely got to pick up a little bit more. I can't forget that. But yeah, it's definitely something we're mindful of as a business, in terms of just getting our teams out there and spending more time with our field and with our customers in the store. And I know our retailers do it a lot as well. A lot of our retailers will meet regularly on a Friday morning in a particular store and do a store walk. And I just think that's so powerful. When you think around retailers at every level, going into stores, working in stores, talking to customers, talking to staff. And I think the other one is online, which is a whole new frontier that we're exploring. Obviously, at the moment we're in, it's a huge part of our strategy. But how do you get onto the customer websites, and how do you start to navigate it as a shopper, and what's the experience like, and how do you start to shape some of our opportunities based off just some of those little interactions that we might have through searching for products or clicking on products, or ads and things like that on the websites.
I see. Yeah, love it. I think a lot of what you're talking to there is a concept, and again, it's just a term, but the term open strategy is becoming more prominent. It's still a fairly new term coming out of Europe and the US.
Yeah.
The concept, as the name expresses, is involving a lot of those people that perhaps weren't traditionally involved in strategy, inverted commas.
Yeah.
So, like you've talked about, those customer conversations, partners, retailers, and even the likes of perhaps traditional competitors, is the principles that open strategy tries to bring. And I can imagine at L'Oreal, a significant, a huge global company, it's tougher to do that with the layers. So I'm not trying to oversimplify things. But those principles, does that, if we look at it, even the strategy discipline, within your career, do those principles ring true? And do you see that's where it's generally heading, involving all those different views?
Yeah, look, absolutely. I think for me and the principles that we apply when we work within L'Oreal, collaboration is obviously a huge one. And sometimes collaboration takes time. Well, in fact, it does. It takes longer. So you're in a fast-paced environment and you've got to collaborate. Well, your initial thinking when you got to move fast is, I can skip that person or I can skip that department. I'll tell them after the fact. And we actually don't do it that way at L'Oreal. So we do collaborate, and it takes a little bit more time. But it's about bringing people on the journey, getting their perspectives as well, that diversity of thought. But I think for me, the most important thing within all of that is the buy-in that you get across the organization. And it's about bringing not just one layer of the organization in. L'Oreal has lots of layers to it. It's about bringing different people from different levels of the business, different perspectives, who are then going to help us execute the strategy. There's no point of a group of people coming up with a fantastic idea and a strategy and some objectives on how we're going to do it, and then pass it over to a sales team or a marketing team to say, off you go. Yes. Bring it to life for us, please. I think you know what it's like yourself. If you're a part of something and you're co-creating it, you're going to have more buy-in and passion to want to deliver it and execute it and help other people understand why it's important. So we try to find these advocates in the business. We build cross-functional teams. It's very fluid. There's no, as I said before, there's no rule book. There's no this person, that person. It's just a natural energy of different people from different parts of the business. And it's amazing how it works. And when it comes together and it works, it's a really good feeling. But I think in summary to what I'm trying to say, it's about involving the people that are also going to help deliver the strategy, execute the strategy. And if you've got those people in the room and they feel part of the journey, they're going to also be the ones to help deliver it and make it a success.
Yeah, I think you've articulated that really nicely, because it's, when you stand back and look at that from a logic, it makes perfect sense, doesn't it? But the point you raised about collaboration, it takes time and effort. And it is so easy. The default isn't, in all our busy roles and lives and businesses. The default is just to get on with it and just get things done, bypass with not a bad intent, but because we want to get things done. But I think that's a really interesting point you made. It takes a lot of time, and we sometimes think that time spent is perhaps wasted time.
Yeah.
But what you've described there about involving the people who are going to execute and collaborating, co-creation, and getting advocates and buy-in, I think that's really what it's doing, isn't it? Through that.
Absolutely. And it's with the customers too. So that's an internal lens, but then how do you bring that to a customer like a Chemist Warehouse or a Woolworths, for example? How do we then have those sessions with them and take them on the journey in terms of these are the insights and these are the reasons why we think you can grow these categories, and this is the role that we're going to play within that. So the steps for us aren't brand first. In fact, we start with the marketplace, the category, the drivers, the insights, and what does that opportunity look like to grow that overall pie. And we've almost flipped that around to where we used to be, where it was, let's go in with the brand, let's go in with the power of the brand, as opposed to now what we're doing is we're going in with, these are the shopper insights, the consumer insights. This is how you can win and grow your overall category, and we want to be part of that. And this is then our role in terms of executing that. But how do we work together on building some of those opportunities? And I think that's when you get the customer bought into that front half, the second half becomes a lot easier because they're really clear in terms of what are the drivers, what's it going to take to unlock growth for their category. And that's how they're talking as well. So they give that feedback to us regularly. If we're not talking category, you don't get as much time, if you like, in their very busy schedules.
Yeah, well, and as you just said there, the conviction that brings then by starting with that consumer insight is very different to these big, broad assumptions that probably aren't really very grassroots on what's happening in consumers' lives.
Exactly.
So just a last strategy question before we finish on in terms of just some of your kind of personal insights and how you're aware and how you're going to for your own development around strategy and broader. Before we do that, in terms of strategy, the short term versus the long term, we see a lot of people struggling with this, especially what we've come through recently. There's still a lot of unknowns and ambiguity, and a lot of organisations struggle to get the balance between meeting the short term demand and some of the challenges, worker shortages, product shortages, and then still keeping the eye on the long term.
Yeah.
Is there any way that you're looking at, seeing it in a better view, or some of the challenges that you're working on between the short and the long term now that you could share?
I think I'll answer the question up front, then I'll go into it. I don't have the answer, to be honest. It's probably the biggest business challenge I think that we're facing at the moment, as well as other organizations, people that I talk to in the industry. I think it's the number one thing at the moment. I think there's a few reasons why. When I think around that challenge that you described, so delivering the short term, but having an eye on what the longer term looks like and having a plan, I think the challenge is actually driven by, if I think around the root cause, the amount of change that we're experiencing in our categories and in our retail landscape, the shifts that we're seeing in channels and where shoppers buy, and the loyalty that used to exist that might not exist today. So I think the dynamic nature of the marketplace, the global marketplace that we're in, the disruption that we're experiencing from different brands or different business models that are coming in, I think that's the context that we're all experiencing at the moment. And so what that means is that puts a lot of pressure on our short term in terms of delivering what we thought was going to be there and might not be. And so it forces a shift of resource to focus on that short term deliverable, because we've got to kind of get through today to get to tomorrow. That's the mindset that we typically have.
Yes.
So I think that's probably the context that when I think around that problem, in terms of how do we solve it and what are the things that we're doing. The first step is we've acknowledged it as a challenge as a business. So, if you think around the most senior people in the organization, it's a conversation that we're having, and it's an agenda item that we're going to have when it comes to how do we problem solve this. And I'm really excited by that, because putting together, again, as I said before, a good group of different people in a room to problem solve this, it's not within just one function. It's not a sales or a marketing or finance or a supply chain challenge. We've all got the same challenge. And so how do we solve that challenge? I'm not going to go through solutions today because I don't really have them other than to say we need to solve it because part of the challenge is it's moving fast, it's changing fast, and it's putting a lot of pressure on people as well. So engagement can be a risk factor.
Cool. It is, and the pressure, and then in keeping, making sure, you know, mental health and well-being is front of mind as well. It's a tough balance, and I think you've touched on the point there. Purely acknowledging it, well, it sounds like you're certainly acknowledging it within the organisation that it is a challenge and that it is a problem to solve. I think that's a really good highlight, because a lot of the time, you know, me included, our customers, our community, don't really take the time to acknowledge and become aware that it is a very significant problem.
Yeah, I think, as I said before, I think it's the number one challenge that we're probably facing at the moment as a broader industry in terms of how do we do it. Things are changing faster. How do you define long-term these days? What's your vision of long-term versus what it was a few years ago? Is there relevancy in a 5-year plan now, or even a 3-year plan? What does that look like? I think my initial and my personal view on it is you still need pillars, you still need anchors that you've got to stick to if they're grounded in the right data and the right insights, but you can be agile. That word's used a lot. You can be agile and flexible, should be flexible around how you get there. So we know where we typically want to end up. How do we get there might not be always as clear. So the tactics that we use, the approaches that we take, they might have to shift as we get new information, new data, as things change. But overarching, as long as we can provide what I think is some anchors in terms of where we think the growth's going to be, where we think the market's going, if they're grounded in the right data and insights, sure, new information will come in, sure, things will change. It's never going to be as we projected. It's about having the flexibility to adjust your tactics as you go. And I think if you get people comfortable in that ambiguity, that could be the new way of looking at it. I'm problem solving, but that's where kind of my head goes to when I think to that topic.
I think it's really helpful, Jordan, because a lot of our viewers and listeners hearing that from, you know, yourself, head of category strategy in a brand like L'Oreal, the fact that you're spending the time to acknowledge and problem solve, I think gives people peace of mind that is a good thing to do. It's not wasting time before you jump into a solution, so-called, without even defining what it is. So thank you for sharing that.
No worries.
So just to finish on, all of our guests, we like to turn from a personal point of view of what perhaps in your own personal development, perhaps, you know, from a strategy perspective, where you're turning to. It could be informal, could be a formal thing. Is there anything that you could share with our audience of where you're getting help in terms of getting a really good read on where strategy is heading in your own discipline?
Yeah, I love this question. I'm a huge believer in focusing on these development goals and working on, you know, what are the gaps in terms of what we're not doing today and what I'm not doing today, and what are the skills that we're going to need in the future. And some of those areas was a lot, to be honest with you, that we're working on, but or I'm working on personally. I suppose the ones that I'll call out, and I think would be relevant for a lot of people, is data analytics. That's number one. You hear a lot around data analytics today. That's arriving faster than I think we ever thought. So sure, when you think data analytics, you might be thinking Power BI, you might be thinking Tableau, and these essentially are just the interfaces. But really behind all of that is, how do you get clean data? How do you get the right data in the right time? What is your source of your data? And how do you then combine all those data sources to help answer some of the business questions and challenges that you've got? And so one of the things that I'm working on, you know, as a senior leader in the business is firstly understanding what those questions are. I'm never going to be able to be a data expert and be able to build these platforms, but what are those business problems, challenges, and questions that we can frame and work with our data team on? I think that's one of the areas that I'm personally trying to work towards, to help enable our data analytics teams to provide those better, you know, beautiful dashboards and things like that, the outputs, essentially. So it's probably the first one. And in terms of data analytics, I think in terms of making better decisions, like that's how we look at data in this business. So We've talked a lot about creativity and intuition and things like that. Incredible how accelerated the data journey is at L'Oreal and how much focus and resource is going behind this, because we've got so much data, we've got so many insights, and we're probably guilty of not using all the data and insights the right way.
That's brilliant, I can imagine.
So for us, it's about, or for me personally, it's about, I'm in a role where data is so important and I can make better decisions with the data. So how do I use this data, which a lot of the time is lagging, but how do I use it to help me project and look forward in terms of, you know, where we might see growth or where opportunities exist, and spend less time on the doing. I usually say to my team, I want to shift the dial from moving, 80% on running the data and 20% then interpreting it, to the other way around, right? So the 80-20 flip, and we're starting to see that now, and it's incredible watching young analysts come up in our business that can spend less time running data, spreadsheets and things like that, and actually working on what we call the so what's, now what. So we know that. Now what are we going to actually do, and what are the actions? And that's the space that we get most excited spending our time in, because it's where the value is.
Brilliant. I think that, yeah, the blend of that, when you talk about data and how it's hugely important, blended with the creativity, the intuitive side, and you talked about, spending this time in stores, getting that futuristic view. The combination of that sounds pretty powerful. As well as, the example you gave us around Red Bull, very different product sets, considering that mindset shift. So I think it's a pretty powerful combination. So thank you for sharing that.
Very welcome. Thank you, Andrew.
Well, it's been a wonderful conversation, and again, sharing right from back in the day of growing up and deserving the family business to now running category strategy, and looking forward to hearing about what's next in the Red Bull conversations, insights, etc. So look forward to catching up again sometime soon.